Good evening. I'm Wendy Brookman from Lobby Exchange, where your voice matters. And I'm in Canberra this evening to talk about the budget at Parliament House, and we are very lucky to be joined with Gary Oliver, who is the CEO from National Congress, Australia's First People. Good evening, Gary.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well.
Tonight. Jeez, yeah.
I know. Gary, there's been some bittersweet discussions this evening about the budget. Could you share your views of the budget and how you think it's going to affect our mob?
Look, if I was in local government, I'd expect it to be a city council budget. Started off with building, garages or carports or something like that. So it's just madness. But we've got a government that's talking about a surplus. They're talking about a huge surplus. Our communities are still suffering. How did we reach that surplus? We reached it from lower class communities. That's how we reached it. We haven't really saw the true figure of the national debt to say that we're in a surplus. I think it was a year ago, we're nearly $1 trillion in debt. And now we talk about having a surplus.
Yeah.
Has someone won lotto and not told us?
Let's hope so, because I have got many ideas of where we can spend it. Now, was there anything that completely sort of shocked you about the budget that was released this evening?
Smacked me in the mouth.
Yes.
Smacked me in the mouth. It was echoing of the Prime Minister's view of the Close the Gap when he spoke to us in the chamber and said, I'm going to do it, HECS debt for teachers that go and do time in remote communities. Teachers that go to remote communities, great profession, and they do wonderful for our kids, but already get a number of allowances, living allowance, cheaper rent and things like that. Why don't we train local Aboriginal people as teachers, and why don't we employ them as teachers? Now, to say go and do 4 years and you're going to get a HECS debt wiped, use that investment, and that's about $70 million, I think I heard tonight. So $70 million that could be reinvested into our communities.
Absolutely, and it's known. We get people that live in our communities, they're trusted in our communities. Yeah. So those are the things that we want to continue doing. The teachers, the doctors, all that type of stuff.
And they're there not for the dollar value. No. They're there for the connection that they have to our communities, to our families and to kids.
Absolutely. And I only just discussed this evening with Dr. Huggins about our future, which is our children, and investing in our children to continue, our future, and making sure that, these things that we're putting in place, closing the gap, the disabilities, all these things that we're putting in place and we're bringing to the government, we're instilling that into and educating our children. Yeah.
So the takeouts from this budget, if we want to install in our children any value, it's going to be about the value of infrastructure. Yeah. There's 100 million for this and 100 million for that, and a bear in there as well. So we've got to be really wary about this, because are there Aboriginal participation plans that are forcing contractors to participate in our communities when there's $100 million investment on a road in Western Sydney, up in Queensland or in WA? There's got to be an alternate that actually includes our mob in some of these workloads.
Well, that's exactly right. We want to develop and create those jobs, keep us into our communities instead of our mob leaving their communities. The other thing as well that I wanted to chat about is, I guess, the lack of new money that we're given, not given.
You must have been around for a few years, hey? Because, we have a look at the budgets over the past few years, and I got excited last year when I heard about millions of dollars there for research money. Yeah. There's an underspend, and it's now in this budget. But we need to get some clarity on that. To say it's not new money, we need to know where it's come from. Because remember, this was the government that reduced the Indigenous expenditure by $585 million. I say it quick so it doesn't cause too much pain. $585 million from the IAS. Yeah. And we know that the IAS has been used for other things. The money for the coalition partnership, is that from the IAS as well? But it didn't feature in tonight's budget. So there was a commitment signed up by the government last week. There's been some discussions with the Prime Minister and from great leaders, the great peaks that we have in this country. However, the Close the Gap, the only mention of that was around education. Is it because they want to keep someone on as a special envoy? Don't do that to us, please.
I know. Yeah. So
It's late.
I know, I know. So the closing the gap was one of the, I guess, the things that everyone's has touched on, simply because it is, the shocking revelation that our gap isn't closing.
Yeah, it isn't.
It isn't closing.
We've had the Redfern statement that has paved this road to where we are around the Closer Gap Refresh, and we participated in Closer Gap Refresh. Still no mention of it within the budget constraints, no forward estimate. Wouldn't you say that we're going to work some targets up and we're going to park $50 million so we can use it instead of just talking about surplus? I want to talk about wages as well in this country. They're saying that they want to eliminate a tax bracket. If you earn $50,000, you'll have $1,000 tax saving. And we had that cheeky face treasurer say, you can pay your car insurance with it. Yeah, how many of our mob got car insurance? How many are mob on $50,000? But do you know, in the same budget paper, if you earn $200,000, do you know how much of a tax break you get? $11,000. What end of town are they looking after? What end of town are they looking after? Yeah.
And unfortunately, when it's put like that,
Yeah.
it's black and white.
So we heard about what they're doing with tax breaks and where that money can be spent and what it can be done. We need a living wage. Do you know we've got some families in urban centres that have got 2 and 3 jobs to pay the rent and pay their livelihoods. So we need a living wage. We need to look at the award wage structure and raise it. We need to look at New Start and raise New Start. We also need to look at the age pension and raise the age pension. None of that was discussed tonight. None of it. And it was just a top end of town around infrastructure and jobs. And I bet some of those mates have paid into this little election bucket for this current election for the government. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is disappointing. It is disappointing because you're right. Like everything, prices go up, but the wages are staying.
Yeah.
And speaking earlier, just the effects that it has on people. If you've got so much, of all these bills and cost of living, food, things like that, the amount of stress that's put on a family.
Yeah. We need to talk about the cost of living because we need to also talk about housing. We heard that there's been a $300 million investment in a social bond that was announced by Corporate Australia well before this election was announced. They talked about an investment in South Australia. Do you know that's not new money? No. It's actually less money than what South Australia would have gotten for remote Indigenous housing. So we need to know what is the investment on social housing, for not only for remote Indigenous housing, because we know Napari finished on the 30th of June, and Scullion spent months arguing with states and territories, and the Northern Territory only brokered a deal last week on money that Scullion promised them. But that took him so long they had to renegotiate with him.
Yeah.
But when they're talking about remote Indigenous housing, don't forget the largest population of Aboriginal people live in Western Sydney. So where's the urban housing spend that's going to support low-income families? Because it's not identified in this budget. So unless we live in a car park. That's what he started off with, yeah.
That is not what we want to hear. No. So is there anything that you would say that gives us that light at the end of the tunnel that we are moving forward and we are getting just a little bit more closer to some things that we need besides, I think, I guess what's been mentioned today is the commission.
Yeah, so the Royal Commission into Disabilities, good on them for funding it. Yeah. It's a Greens idea. The Greens brought it to the House and the Greens actually forced them into voting for it. So it was a Greens idea, but that shows that Parliament can work together.
Yes.
So there's a Royal Commission into Disabilities, and I'm sure that will help our First Nations disability peak body, because over 40% of us have disabilities.
That's right.
So we've got to remember that number as well. Yeah. And a Royal Commission into aged care, I think that's very important as well. So what's going to happen into that space? We do need to know, though, that NDIS is going to be increased because there was an underinvestment there for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and especially in remote areas of this country.
Yeah, which is unfortunate because that's where we're getting, and we're living in this beautiful country, almost like third world, out in remote communities, not having the services that we should have. And I think it was said brilliantly by Dr. Huggins, which was what we deserve.
Yeah.
It's purely what we deserve.
What we deserve. And, you know, housing shelter's a human right.
That's right.
You know, it's in the United Nations framework that this country fails. You know, we're going to host the World Indigenous Housing Conference because we want to bring an international spotlight on Australia.
Yeah.
You know, so we want to be able to tell the truth of what's happening within this space as well. So the conversation's not just going to be about housing. It's going to be about health outcomes. It's going to be about domestic violence. It's going to be about housing for those that have been incarcerated. Where do they go when they get out? So we're going to have all of those conversations all in one. A big conversation that, you know, Canada have told us they're going to bring to the table, and the States, they're going to bring information about their treaties.
Yes.
And we've actually got the Minister for Maori Affairs coming over as well. You know, there's money being put aside again in this budget for the voice or constitutional recognition or something like that. It all fits into a black box, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But it's to have a look at it again.
Yeah.
You know, how many years are we going to be consulted around this? Make a decision. There's been a report from the Referendum Council. Let's get on with the business of it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.
No worries.
And hopefully in coming weeks with the election that's coming up, hopefully we can use our voice just that little bit more.
A message to Queenslanders. You
Yes.
know, there were 5 seats in Queensland around the election last time, 5 seats that held the balance of power. All you Murrays, get out there, get on the electoral roll and vote.
Absolutely.
Let's get the change we deserve.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. And that's us signing out. And as always, your voice counts.
Great, thank you.
Pleasure.